Hello, my name is Neil Morgan. I'm your York County Administrator. Joining me today are our two Deputy County Administrators, Vivian McGettigan and Mark Carter. The purpose of our show today is to talk with you about our plans for the upcoming FY 16-17 operating budget and the related capital improvement program, major activities of the county government, which will be the focus of much of our effort and hopefully much of your interest over the next several months. Before we start, I want to tell you just a little bit about your team here, sitting here having this conversation. I'm going to start with Mark. Mark and his family have long lived in York County. He has a background in urban affairs and planning, has spent much of his professional life working in the county, and was the interim administrator and responsible for the last time we went through the operating budget here in the county. Vivian McGettigan has a background in business administration, and she's a professional accountant by training. She spent many years in various local governments in other parts of the state in the Richmond and Northern Virginia area before coming to York County about 3 years ago. This, of course, is my first operating budget in York County, having come to work in June of 2015, and my background basically is in the areas of government, economics, and public administration. So with that introduction, we'll get into the meat of today's show. And what we're going to do is talk about the budgeting situation we face, the budget environment, if you will, and we're going to talk about the process, some of the basics of what's comprised in a budget, the relationship between the budget and the capital budget, and some of the things as interested citizens that you can watch for and some opportunities you will have to give us input and participate in the process. So Vivian, we call you money bags around here. And with your background, I think probably this first question starts with you. When you're talking about an operating budget in local government, just give us a little sense of some of the major elements of an operating budget, ours or any other one for that matter.
Well, York is very similar to many other counties that are approximately our size. The most significant amount of our budget is spent on education. Education includes not only our transfer to the school division, but it also includes our libraries. The second largest part of our budget is our public safety area. And in public safety, that includes the sheriff's staff, as well as fire and life safety, and our emergency communications staff, and the radio towers that go with that, and equipment that goes with that as well. The next largest area is our public works department. Recently, two departments were merged, our general services and our environmental services, to create our public works area, and they represent 7% of the budget. So when you add all of that together, we basically have 25% remaining in our operating budget, and that covers the remainder of our constitutional officers, our Commissioner of Revenue, Treasurer, the court system with the Commonwealth Attorney, as well as Parks and Recreation, all of our support departments, finance, IT, and human resources. So as you can see, there are a lot of departments that are represented in that 25%. That also covers any debt service we may have on any outstanding debt for both the county and the schools.
And we'll want to talk about that a little bit more when we turn to the capital budget. Just to step back for a second, and to, at the risk of repeating, so clearly education and public safety are the big two. That's yes. Your main point. Mm-hmm. And then the operational components of the county, what we now call public works, and then pretty much everything else. Mm-hmm. People might be wondering, just sort of order of magnitude, how big is the county's budget? Not holding to an exact number, but just to give people a sense of it.
Well, when you look just at our operating budget, we're around $130 million, a little okay. more than that. And that covers the transfer to the schools. That does not cover the schools' budget itself.
And so that's what a lot of people would call the general fund, mm-hmm. sort of the main yes. activities of the government. And sometimes it's a little bit confusing when people are trying to understand our finances. It's even confusing to us because there are many funds, and you have internal service funds like vehicle services where we charge back for the cost of vehicles. Mm-hmm. You have enterprise funds where fees are charged, such as with the sewer fund or solid mm-hmm. waste. And so there's some other elements. But typically when we're talking about expenditures, we tend to talk about that $133 million figure and relate it to the general fund. So that's kind of how we spend the money, broad brush, by functional category. I think another way to think about how we spend money is what kind of things do we spend the money on? Could you sort of take a shot at answering it that way?
Absolutely. Well, in our general fund budget, the first expense off the bat is our transfer to the schools. They are they're our number one priority here in the county, and that represents 38% of our budget. And then we also have our salaries and benefits for the staff that are in all of the county departments that are charged to our operating fund, and that is another 35% of our budget. And from there, we have debt service, which is 7%, and then the remainder of that goes for everything else that we spend money on here. It's the utilities to keep the buildings going, it's the general maintenance within those buildings, it's the small equipment that we have, it's supplies and operations, it's the insurance on our facilities. And so, as you can see, the vast majority, once you remove the school division from the rest of the general fund, the vast majority of our budget goes to salaries and benefits for the staff who work in our.
And of course, even if you were slicing and dicing the school part of the budget, just like much of the expenditure of general county services is for people, because we're in the people business, the same would apply to the school dollars. If you took those school dollars or other dollars they get from state and federal sources, the vast majority of their expenditures are for people as well.
In fact, I had not calculated that, but my guess would be theirs would be even higher because of the emphasis on the teachers that are in the classrooms and the staff that are in the classes.
And Mark, just a comment, on your experience when you had to come up with a recommended budget last year, and everybody's always conscious about being efficient and keeping costs under control. Doesn't in many ways it kind of comes down to staffing?
Does, absolutely. And we didn't have any requests for additional staffing last year, which is unusual. Some years there have been requests for multiple new staff positions. We knew we needed to hold the line last year and try to do what needs to be done with the existing staffing levels that we had. And it puts a crunch on everybody because everybody works harder.
Waiting for me.
Absolutely,
yes,
that's right.
Right. So, so we talked a little bit about the expenditure side, and obviously the other side of the operating budget is where the money comes from. Tax revenues, fees, transfers from other levels of government, state and federal government. At a high level, would you comment a little bit about that? Where's the money come from?
Well, our general fund is primarily funded by our real estate. It represents about 50% of our budget, and just as a point of reference, 75% of that comes from our residential properties, and about another 25% comes from our commercial and industrial areas. Personal property taxes, which are all of the vehicles that we have in the county, that represents 11% of our budget, so that's our next largest funding source. We also receive 10% of our funding from the state, and that funding comes by way of grants as well as funding for our constitutional officers. Some people are not aware, but the state actually funds our sheriff as well as some of the sheriff's staff and the Commissioner of Revenue, Treasurer, Commonwealth Attorney, and the Clerk's Office all receive a portion of that. And so we watch very carefully as this week, we're in December right now, the governor will be releasing his budget later in the week, so we'll be watching very closely to see what those impacts may be, because that's one that is harder for us to predict as the budget process goes through. But again, it's 10% of our budget.
Well, and just to make the point again, while we're always talking about this revenue source and that revenue source and what's happening, the folks are probably looking at a graph during some of this discussion. In local government in Virginia, whether you're a wealthy community or a not so wealthy community, a lot of it does still boil down to the real estate tax. In your county, that's even a little bit more true than some other places. Mark, I know you've been working on our legislative priorities at the state level. Would you care to give a couple of examples of why, under the rules of the state, the county kind of has a different set of rules than, say, than a city when it comes to raising money?
Well, there are some examples of that. Yes, cities do enjoy some taxing authorities. Cities and towns enjoy some taxing authorities that counties don't have. The two primary examples are the cigarette tax and the admissions tax, both of which could generate pretty significant amounts of revenue that would help supplement the revenue available from the more traditional ones like the real estate and personal property.
And the third one I would add is the meals tax, because while we have a meals tax in York County, by state rule, counties can only have a 4-cent meals tax, whereas our neighboring cities can have whatever tax they want. Point being, not whether we have that particular tax, but we can't even talk about it. We don't have the right to think about it. So when we have a revenue need, we're pretty much forced to go to property tax because that's where the money is, at least the way the rules are currently.
And even when we have been granted some of those additional taxes like the meals tax or the lodging tax, the General Assembly has seen fit to put some restrictions on it. For example, saying that a certain percentage of that revenue has to be spent on a specific purpose as opposed to being available for general county purposes.
Right. So, all right. Well, that's good. I'm not sure if either one of you all have anything else you want to say kind of on just the basics of what make up an operating budget, or are we ready to move on to the capital budget?
I think we're ready to move on, unless you'd like to talk about maybe some of the trend analysis through the recessionary period and funding associated with that.
Well, I think that is important, Vivian. So the reality is, since the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, trends in local government revenue have looked a lot different than if you were drawing those same graphs 7, 8 years ago.
Yes.
Go ahead and comment.
And we do actually draw those graphs. While we only mentioned a few of our revenues, we actually have over 200 revenue codes that we do actually track. And so very generally, in 2009, everything was good here in York, and we saw very drastic drop-offs in some of our revenues during that time. The state also encountered similar issues. We also lost a major real estate taxpayer during that time, so that's had some impacts.
That's the refinery?
So when you look back 7 years and you think about the county budget, the county's budget, when you remove the school portion of it, is actually down 3% from where it was in 2009. And the school division 7 years later is only up 3%. And those two don't actually tie to each other because, I mean, it's more complicated because of other funding. But
the schools really have taken a big hit from the state.
They have taken a large hit, and the county has assisted as best they can. Both sides really have suffered through that. So 7 years later, when you look at inflation having been 14% during that, about 2% per year, to be down 3% and then to only be up 3% on the school side has had an impact on services.
So your point being that's before any adjustment for inflation.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
In real dollars, probably the county's spending at about 25% lower than it was before the recession. Now, some folks will listen to that and say, okay, that sounds good. That sounds like we've made efficiencies, we've tightened our belt, both on the county side and the school side. Fair enough. But let's talk just a little bit about those efficiencies. How does York County compare to other places? Because one of the things I noticed when I came to work here is if you look at York County compared to comparable communities in Hampton Roads, we have a lesser number of employees per capita. We have low levels of debt. We have low levels of expenditure per capita.
Well, Neil, I actually have a slide which I think we're going to be sharing with those who are watching this, which shows our traditional performance measures. The reason I like these is because they're objective measures, because it's comparing us to others using very consistent financial data. So, for example, when we look at our real estate tax rate, we're at 75.15 cents, and as you can see on the chart, we're down on the right-hand side, so only a couple are lower than us in our regional regional area. When you look at local government employees per capita, we are actually at 10, which is tied with James City at the lowest number of employees that we hire in order to provide service to our citizens. Another way to look at that is, what do we actually just simply spend dollar-wise to provide services? And those we go through to make sure we're comparing with our other jurisdictions. So for example, cities, we take the road piece out of that as we're comparing. But as you can see on this, we're the lowest in the region in providing those services, which again leads to efficiency. We believe, all of the employees here believe, we provide very high quality services. This is just a way of showing that we do it a little less expensively, a little more efficiently than our comparable peers.
Well, and certainly in the time I've been here, I've noticed that you know, I would have to say our staffing's a little bit on the thin side compared to my previous experience. And without getting into all those details, what those graphs show are, for any community that has the density of York County, we provide the local government services pretty inexpensively. We compare quite favorably by any reasonable measure of efficiency. Before we move on to the capital budget, there was one other thing we mentioned in passing. We were talking about what has happened with school funding, in particular related to the state. And Mark, I see you've got that open to that graph. Would you just put a real dollar term on what's happened in sort of the local state funding mix for our public schools in recent years?
Well, just in general, the state funding has gone down and the county's picked up the slack. It has had to do that to compensate for the drop in state funding that's available to the schools. And the county, the Board of Supervisors has done a really good job of recognizing that as a priority and stepping up to the plate and diverting additional county revenue to the school system.
And probably just about everybody watching the show would say York County prides itself on the quality of its schools and the quality of its outcomes, and I think probably everyone feels good that the county has stepped it up. But there is a certain reality if you're in my situation, and I'm thinking about the rest of the county operations and how we pay the bill. The simple fact is, since the Great Recession, the county has increased expenditures to the schools by over $6 million, and the state has decreased expenditures to our schools in York County by almost $5 million. That's a major, major swing. And you know, if I had that $6 million, we could do a lot of things on the county side. But that is our reality, and we hope, and working as a team with the school system, we've been making a lot of noise at the state level. It's time for the state to step up and do what needs to be done to fund our public schools and take a little of the pressure off of local government. And that's really not just a York County thing, that's all around the Commonwealth of Virginia. We're going to take a short break, and then we're going to talk about the capital improvement plan.
Traditional light bulbs actually generate 9 times more heat than light. Let's switch to Energy Star light bulbs and stop burning through cash. Saving energy saves you money.
Maybe he's really focused.
Hey, Michael. Michael. Maybe he likes spinning the wheels.
Maybe he just loves trucks.
Maybe he's just being a boy.
Preoccupation with objects is one early sign of autism. Learn the others today. The sooner it's diagnosed, the better.
We're back. The capital improvement plan is a major activity of county government. Mark, I'm going to ask you to take the lead on this portion. You have recently led a process, a committee to review our capital improvement plan and make recommendations for the future. Would you talk a little bit about the process, but why don't you start with, what is a capital improvement plan?
Okay. Well, a capital improvement plan or program is a multi-year program or guide to spending money to address the county's infrastructure needs, building needs, equipment needs, things like, do we need new roofs on buildings? Do we need new parking lots? Do we need to have those parking lots repaired? Do we need new school buses or various types of other equipment? York's capital improvement program is a 10-year plan. The first year, so far, right? And many localities have a shorter time frame. Right. Some have 5, 6 years, whatever. The first year of the plan represents the financial commitments that are made in the adopted budget. Okay. So it's the money that's actually going to be spent on those capital facility needs or capital equipment needs. The out years, or the years 2 through 10 in our case, represent a plan, a way of trying to identify and show a general dollar amount for what they may cost, and also a sequence of when they may need to be actually accomplished.
So the further out in time that goes, the more of a sort of an educated guess it is. The closer in to the next operating budget, the sort of more real it is.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so for the homeowners, a capital item might be you need a new roof on your house, or you need a new furnace. In terms of county facilities, it's much greater magnitude, but in general, we're looking at projects that have a useful life of multiple years, and generally have a dollar amount of about $50,000 or more.
So to use the household budget analogy again, the county's capital improvement program is a plan to buy, replace, repair things that have a multi-year life, the kind of things that you wouldn't typically pay for out of your annual budget because the life of the expenditure goes on for many years. In some cases, 30 years, 40 years, exactly. In some cases maybe 5 to 10.
Correct, right.
Well, why don't you share with the viewers some of the more significant items that are in the capital plan that you've been working on leading us with?
Well, first, if I could, I'll say a word about the process that we used this year that actually you recommended and instituted. It's a new way of reviewing our CIP, or our capital project needs. We brought together all the various departments and offices that are responsible for the various functional areas in the county, whether it's public works or schools or utilities or infrastructure, IT needs, those sorts of things. And they had already submitted their requests to the budget staff. The budget staff racked all those things up in terms of a nice spreadsheet to show everybody what the dollar amounts were and what years they had been proposed. And we brought those people together, and they were each responsible for explaining their projects. And obviously everybody feels like their project is the highest priority in the world, but the benefit of that committee discussion was that everybody learned a little bit more about each other's projects. Everybody learned that their project was not necessarily the highest priority, and they learned why. They learned why, for example, we need certain things at certain times, and why certain other things can be deferred because of either lack of funding or because they're just not as high a priority as some other project. In terms of specific projects...
So excuse me on that. So since I'm the one that will have to ultimately sort of put my name on the document and say, Board of Supervisors, citizens, this is what I recommend, the advantage of that kind of process is all of our senior staff people kind of get to hear it, and when I have to make cuts that make people displeased, at least maybe everybody kind of has heard the same thing and kind of understands why some things have to take priority over others.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of what's going on.
That's right. And the committee talked about things in terms of whether it's a legal requirement that the project be done. For example, sooner or later we're going to need to replace some fuel tanks that run the risk of leaking, and that's a liability issue to the county and a legal issue if it does happen. Then they're the nice to have kind of things that we'd really like to do, but we just can't afford to do. And so we also looked at whether projects are in consistency with the comprehensive plan. We looked at whether there's a capacity issue that needs to be solved, or whether there's a public safety issue or a health matter that needs to be solved.
Or in some cases, if you build it, you actually increase your operating expenditure because it requires more people. In other cases, if you build it, it might decrease your operating expenditure because the facility would be more efficient than an old one, those types of things.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
that's right.
So talk to us about some of the particulars.
So the particulars, highest on the list is the Grafton Fire Station replacement. That's a project that's been underway for the past couple of years. The county actually purchased the land for that new fire station that needs to be relocated. For one, because of the Route 17 widening project that's going to impact the operational needs of that station, and also the building has just reached its maximum useful life. So there's a new station site that's been purchased on Dare Road at the intersection of North Constitution Drive. And so now the next step in the process is to fund the actual construction of the building. And so that's one of the things that we programmed into the CIP.
And that, I think we'll probably all agree that that'll be a high priority on the county side, certainly.
Yes. From the standpoint of a health and safety kind of an issue, the Carver Gardens water system replacement is high on the list. That's a project to replace an aging, privately owned water system that serves about half of the Carver Gardens neighborhood. The pipes are prone to leaking. They are have diminished capacity because they've rusted shut in many cases.
And in this case, we can combine it with a sewer project that we needed to do anyway, so we can kind of tear everything up once and modernize the under-the-street infrastructure.
Correct, and that's one of the projects that can be funded with a combination of what we call enterprise funds, which are the funds that are generated by the user fees that people pay for their sewer systems, or
Right.
their trash, for example, is also another enterprise fund. But what's been recommended is to pay for that Carver Gardens system with about half general fund money and about half enterprise fund money. Another thing that's high on the list will be fire and rescue apparatus replacement. Those types of vehicles and apparatus have a limited useful life. They're
not cheap.
They're not cheap. They're monitored very closely as far as the hours that they run. One of the things that people look at as well and say, that vehicle doesn't have many miles on it, but what happens,
it sits there and idles.
It sits there and idles, exactly, when they respond. So they keep good track of the hours of operation. Another project is to purchase a generator for use at one of the county's emergency shelters. So God forbid we have a hurricane, we need a generator capacity at those shelters to house the people who might be displaced in a major storm event.
And that's certainly a priority for me when I make my recommendations. Emergency-related things have to be high on the list.
We have information technology needs. We have
Vivian was waiting for you to mention that.
We have an infrastructure management system that needs to be replaced. That's a major upgrade that keeps track of all the various sewer pipes and valves and whatnot that are monitored by our utilities department or division. We also have a financial management system and information technology need.
And if I could just say, to citizens, when you think about the capital improvement plan, it's probably a lot easier to understand a school or a fire station, but we have to also be concerned about these technology infrastructure items. We have a 30-year-old financial accounting system that's going to take probably about 3 years to design and procure and install, and that's a big deal, and it has to be done. But you, as a citizen looking in, don't really see that. It's kind of like a sewer line under the road. You don't really see it, but somebody's got to worry about it.
Right.
What about on the school side?
On the school side, well, two things on the school side. During the recessionary times and the post-recession, there was a lot of deferred maintenance. Both the county and the school system are facing that.
And they've got more buildings, more roofs, more windows, more air conditioners than the county.
So there's pent-up demand for those maintenance things that are not cheap. A roof is a very expensive thing. An HVAC system for a school is a very expensive thing. On the county side, we have the same sort of needs, although diminished, or not of that
scale.
magnitude, right? And then the big thing from the school system standpoint is a new elementary school to deal with the capacity issues that are facing the Yorktown and Magruder attendance zones. And the school division and the county are currently engaged in discussions about where can we place where can we find a new site for an elementary school, and when does it need to be programmed in terms of not only land acquisition, but also building construction.
And
So that's a big ticket item.
For sure, and I think it's fair to say both on the county and the school system side, we're committed to move that project forward. And as an order of magnitude, we're talking about a $25 billion project,
Right.
so 4 times as expensive as a fire station.
Right.
Which kind of brings me to a good segue. Vivian, let you get in just a little bit on this capital improvement plan discussion. It's kind of hard to explain. It's kind of hard to understand, frankly, but there's a relationship between the capital improvement plan and the operating budget. Now, Mark mentioned the first year of the plan, typically we appropriate as an actual expenditure plan as sort of a supplement to the operating budget. And that's kind of a number and a list of things, and everybody can understand that. But the harder part is as you spend money for these long-term projects, it generates an expenditure in the operating budget. Could you just try to talk as simply as possible about how that works?
Okay. There are basically 2 impacts. As you mentioned, you have to pay for those capital projects. And the funding source for that really will come from the operating fund in one of 2 ways, either by way of cash financing it or by looking at debt service. The second impact is the operational expense, as Mark had mentioned. Sometimes you build a building and you will have some costs associated with that. So I'd like to just break that into 2 pieces for just a second. When we look at the capital projects, and in talking about the school will have a long-term life. It will benefit future taxpayers as well as the current taxpayers. It is the ideal candidate for a project that you would debt finance.
Pay for over time.
Yes, because you need the cash now to build that building, but because that one is partially driven by increases in student population, by debt financing that over, and typically we finance those over 20 years, then you're matching better that expense related to that school with those who benefit in the future.
So the people who will use it will pay for it.
And I'll talk about the operating expense on that one, and then I'll switch over and talk a little bit about the fire station. So as far as the schools go, when we build a new school, there's staff associated with that. There are utilities, there's maintenance costs associated with that building, and that will hit the school's operating fund, and the county will fund a portion of that by way of transfers in the future. But as we look at staffing a school, you'll have a new principal, a new vice principal, a librarian. Some teachers will be new, and some will reallocate as along with the students. But over time, the expectation is as that student population grows, you do have, you build up to what that total.
So the schools will need
capacity
money
is.
to operate the school.
Yes, they absolutely will. To contrast that a little bit with the fire station, we have an existing fire station now, and so the staff that will move, we'll have staff that will move from that fire station over, because one will essentially close, and the staff and the equipment will move over to that station.
So it won't necessarily directly impact the operating budget from a standpoint of people.
Yes, that's also, the fire station is also another good example of a project that you would typically debt finance. It is a structure, it's a building, 20 years, it's certainly going to live a life expected to live more than 20 years. So that project we would look at debt financing as well. Then you may look at some other capital projects. There is a fair amount of cash funding that goes into the CIP each year. We have a history of doing that.
But of course, that's just like a family budget. You have a certain amount of savings, and you got to be careful that you don't use all your savings for that, because you need to keep some. The state calls it a rainy day fund. You need to keep some for unanticipated emergencies. If you could, I know this is a little arcane for folks, but also talk about how debt service impacts the operating budget, because the reality is sometimes you need to borrow money for like a school or a fire station, and you borrow, for every million you borrow and pay back over 20 years, in the next operating budget you have to come up with something like 100,000. And so to some degree, when Mark and his committee say, here's the CIP we recommend, and we say, yeah, we need this, this could probably wait, this has got to move forward, how do we juggle all this around? And it's really hard to be precise about it, but we know that the more of that there is, the more it goes into the operating budget.
Well, we actually have a model that does look at what is the debt service that we're currently committed to and how does that pay off over the long term. In the model that we're using now, we're using 6 years and then an example that goes out to 10. But as you had mentioned a moment ago, as we think through the capital projects we have, for every $10 million, you can generally assume there's about $1 million of debt service that'll go in if you finance it over 20 years. To pull a little bit on the house, the home mortgage, and just look at some components on that, when you are potentially buying your first home, you're looking at your budget at that point, and you're looking at that, what will that mortgage payment do? So this is similar to a mortgage payment when you do a capital financing piece. But then, as we talked about the roofs, not everybody has the money to replace a roof or overhaul their HVAC system. You would also look at, if you financed that, what would the impact be of those? And there are some, as we look at the CIP, not all of those will we finance over 20 years. And when you look at painting your home, often that's out of current dollars and not financed. So we try to look at a couple of issues. One is, who are the people who are the taxpayers that should pay it? So in the example of the school, again, that one is a longer stretch. If you're just painting a school or painting one of our office buildings, maybe our office buildings are probably a better example.
Budget.
We have operating money associated with that.
So knowing that we need to also talk about the process coming up in the budget and this running a little bit long, I guess the fundamental point there is that the capital budget has a lot of very urgently needed long-term projects, and we somehow have to narrow that list down and figure out its impact on the operating budget, because to some degree it directly competes with other things in the operating budget, like salaries or computer replacement or anything else that you would typically have in the operating budget. So with that, I'd like to go to talk a little bit about where we're at in the budget process, sort of what we know and what we don't know about the upcoming budget. And you heard earlier Vivian talking about the major expenditures and the major revenues on our budget. And of course, from year to year, those broad categories are not going to change. They adjust slightly. What do we know that's going to change? Well, by the time you watch this show, if you're a homeowner, you will probably have received your new assessment. The county has a 2-year assessment cycle, and so certainly there will be a small amount of revenue growth in our budget because of assessments. The preliminary information, though, is it's pretty modest. The assessor described our real estate situation as stable, so it's not going to be some big windfall. So we'll know we'll have a little bit of local revenue from real estate, from personal property, and from consumer taxes like meals and sales, but that's sort of on the 1%, 1.5% scale. One of the things we don't know much about is what the state is going to do. If the state does well by the schools this year, as has been rumored, that could give us some significant relief, because the schools might be able to take care of some of their challenges without looking to the county, at least in a large way, to help out, as has been in the case in recent years. There's some other unknowns out there. Either one of y'all care to comment about, so this is being taped right at the beginning of winter, probably in the February time frame these things start coming into focus. Other things we know and don't know at this point.
Well, I think you pretty much hit on what we know and don't know at this point. So if you'd like, I could talk a little bit about the process we use for revenue projecting and the team concept we have in place.
Sure.
We basically have, we look at our revenues independent of the expenditures, and we have a revenue team, which includes the Commissioner of Revenue and the Treasurer, finance staff. I'm on that one as well. We look at our 10-year trends because they do tell us what has happened. So many of our revenue sources have not restored back to their 2008 level. So for example, while we see positive sales tax numbers coming in now, that is an area we'll watch very closely, because with internet sales, there's no way for the state ever from a practical standpoint to get those revenues to us. And 1% of our sales tax comes back to the county.
So for example, if you go online and buy something of some Vermont catalog, chances are the county isn't going to get that
we will not
sales tax revenue, whereas if you went to a store in the county, we would.
Yes, yes. So that's just an area that we will continue to watch. We are seeing some positive trends as we looked at the close of 15. Some of the areas where we had positive trends were our personal property tax. That's an area hit by the recession. Often when you start the recession, people will hold off on buying cars. They may actually have a third vehicle and decide to get rid of those vehicles. So we did, over the last couple of years, start to see those trend upwards. So there's more confidence, and that goes to consumer confidence.
Sure.
Because when you feel secure that you have income to pay, then you're more likely to buy discretionary items at that point.
And just to be a little bit cautionary on that point, I'm reminded that your county, is part of the Hampton Roads region.
Yes.
And how we're doing in York County cannot be separated from how Williamsburg and Norfolk and Newport News and Virginia Beach are doing. So unfortunately, Hampton Roads, compared to lots of other parts of the country, has been kind of just very slowly growing. So that kind of holds down our estimates on the revenue side. But I think your summary, Vivian, is there'll be some modest expectation for revenue growth, but nothing to write home about. And on the expenditure side,
that's true.
It's all the usual issues. Mark, you want to comment any about some of the issues that we would typically, you were worried about last year and I'm worried about this year?
Well, we mentioned earlier that York County is very proud of the services that its staff renders to citizens. And so one of the things that's been high on the Board of Supervisors list is compensation for county employees, keeping the compensation package competitive in the region. And so that we looked very hard at that last year, trying to find a way to provide some modest increase in compensation. I would imagine that's going to be an issue that needs to be at least considered this year as well.
Yep.
We've talked about the CIP needs, the facility needs, and those types of things, which certainly are looming out there. Those are the two things that come to my mind most immediately.
Well, and if I had answered my own question, that's probably the two I would have picked. On the capital improvement plan side, since the recession, York County, like a lot of other local governments, has kind of moved projects, what we say, move it to the right, so we didn't have to pay for it. But you do that over a number of years, and the need accumulates. And so we really got to sort of face that issue squarely and see, can we get the capital budget on a sustainable level, and then what will that mean on the expenditure side of the operating budget. So certainly maintaining our excellent workforce and right-sizing the capital budget, I think, are the big items going forward. And we'll keep our fingers crossed the state comes through for the schools, because if we got a little pressure taken off of us there, that would be great. I think maybe it's time to sort of wrap this with a little summary of how interested citizens can follow what's going to happen with the operating budget process. Vivian, I'll give you a chance to sort of hit the highlights. Between now and May, what should folks be watching for?
Well, on January 19th, that is the opportunity for citizens to come and speak to the board in the public forum. And then in February, the Board of Supervisors will have a joint meeting with the school board, at which point they will share issues as both the Board of Supervisors and the school board work on developing the budgets. From March 1st through the end of April, there are 7 work sessions basically scheduled with the board on various topics that have not been identified yet. The board will identify what some of those topics are. We'll make some recommendations to them as well.
And probably some of those things we were just talking about, the relationship between the capital budget, compensation, what's going on with schools.
And of course, most excitingly, on March 15th, our County Administrator Neil Morgan will be presenting his proposed budget. And April 21st is another important date for the citizens, because that's the opportunity for public comment on the tax rate as well as on the budget. And the board will consider all of the various issues that have been presented, from the proposed budget through the work sessions through the public comment to then on May 3rd. That is the date that is scheduled for the board to approve the tax rates as well as the upcoming budget.
Okay. So throughout that process, there'll be opportunities for citizens to monitor what is going on. They'll have at least a couple of public hearing opportunities to advocate or make suggestions. You did mention that critical date of when I have to recommend an operating budget. And during all that process, we'll also have to finalize our recommendations for the capital budget. It is my intention that for the viewing public, we will have another television show on the budget. Right now, my thinking is about the time I recommend the budget to the board, we'll share the highlights with the viewing audience. And of course, all of this information will also be made available on our website in as timely a manner as possible. So it's about time for a wrap. I want to give everybody a chance to make any final comments about what we see in front of us during the always challenging budget process. Vivian?
I just wanted to say the staff are hard at work pulling together information to advise Neil on the budget, and January will be an exciting month for us as we look at finalizing revenue forecasting, and also the departments will be meeting to discuss their budgets with us as well.
Thank you. Mark?
I think all I could say is ditto to what you said, always challenging.
How about good luck?
Good luck, yes.
Okay.
Better you than I.
Okay. Yeah, and we didn't dwell on it, but there's a lot of inside baseball, of course, going on. We talked about the external process, but during January and February, I'll be receiving all this information from regional groups and all of the operating entities, and we'll be looking for the right balance to come up with a recommended budget that the Board of Supervisors and the citizens can get behind. So we'll do our best, and I want to thank you all for joining me in this endeavor of discussing the operating environment for your county in 2016-2017. Well, I think we've covered this topic with some thoroughness. Hopefully you found this summary of our operating budget environment for 2016-2017 to be informative. On the screen as this show ends is the information about how to contact the county, the staff, as well as the Board of Supervisors. We encourage you to monitor the process as we proceed to conclude a successful budget process in the spring of 2016. Thanks for your interest, and have a good day.